Welcome, tennis fans, to the 30th episode of Tennis Traverse, Exploring the Game, the podcast that delves into the heart of the tennis world. I'm your host, Ivy J. And in today's episode, I have Ben Rothenberg joining me, which is like one of the people I look up to the most in the media industry in general. He's like one of the people I actively follow on Twitter. I actively like read all his stuff, and this is of course me after editing, and I truly learned so much from this episode, and I think you guys will definitely learn a lot as well. And I just can't believe this is my 30th episode, guys. I've been doing this for 30 weeks now, and it's more than half a year. And I'm just so grateful for everyone that's listening. And yeah, I was talking with my mom the other day, and I was talking about how this podcast literally became like my kid. I'm like so invested in it and watching it and nurturing it. So yeah, I'm just really grateful, and I have left all the social media links of Ben Rothenberg and myself in the description below. Follow my social medias, his social medias. There's Twitter, Instagram, and if you are listening on YouTube, comment, like, and subscribe. If you're listening on other streaming platforms, please rate my show. And to be honest, let's just get right into today's episode. It's also the longest episode yet, so yeah. He is one of the podcast hosts of No Challenges Remaining, a sports journalist publishing for the New York Times, USA Today, Washington Post, etc., and the author of Naomi Osaka, Her Journey to Finding Her Power, and that's like one of my favorite tennis biographies. So please welcome Ben Rothenberg.
Thank you for having me, Ivy. Very excited to be here. And thank you for, I listened to your episode about the book also, so I appreciate you reading it and going in depth about it. I thought that was very, very cool and appreciated. So thank you.
Yeah, I really loved the book. I liked how thoughtful it was, and the details, especially like the notes of Naomi. I think it really kind of brings the readers to understand her perspective, which is super valuable,
Hmm.
I feel like. Okay, so let's
Yeah.
just dive right into our first topic, which is being a sports journalist. So, as I said this before, it is my dream, and I know that I'm not quite there yet, but you've been there for such a long time. And I just want to know what inspired you to do what you do.
Well, first off, I think you're closer than you think because you're already doing it.
Thank
You know,
you.
you're already making a podcast and being regular about it and being consistent about the output, and that's huge. And that's a big hurdle that a lot of people never clear, honestly, having that kind of initiative. And that's when I get a lot of questions from people when they say, "Oh, I want to be a tennis writer," usually, or sometimes a tennis podcaster, I guess. I say the thing you should do, the first thing is to write about tennis, just start doing it. There's no in the internet these days, there's everyone has the opportunity to have a platform or a voice or a place to put their words and their thoughts. And taking that kind of initiative to actually do it, I think is the most important first step that a lot of people who have that idea never actually even do. But and or at least maybe they do it and they realize they don't enjoy it or they don't keep it up or whatever it is. But you're already doing that, so I think you're already showing a lot of potential and progress and promise in those ways. So congratulations on that part. And then yeah, then there is obviously the sort of more formal turning that initiative and that self-starting career, which can take many different sort of transitions possibly to it. I was a blogger to start, and I worked for my own blog, and then it got folded into SB Nation, which was a network of sports blogs. So I was doing their tennis blog, and then eventually started getting credentials for a couple of tournaments through SB Nation or through my blog, and then yeah, and then wound up meeting someone from the New York Times eventually at a tournament in Cincinnati, and she connected me with the editors there. Started doing blogging, which the New York Times used to have its own sports blogs, and then yeah, started contributing for them as a freelancer, which is what I was for my whole time there for yeah 10 or 11 years. Yeah, so that's the short. And then along the same way, I also started NCR, the podcast, about a year or a few months after starting at the New York Times with Courtney. So yeah, so that's the basic gist of it. But like I said, I think you're already, you know, putting yourself out there and doing stuff and being consistent with your output. And so those are all very positive qualities that will, I think, serve you well going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's super easy nowadays to just put out your opinions because of all, like, I'm currently trying to write for a tennis magazine, and it's just super easy to do that. You can just reach out to them, and if they give you a reply, you can just start writing. So I think it's really important, I guess, if you want to start, to just write and just like put your voices out there.
Yeah, totally. Just if you want to do it, just do it. Like, again, I think you can be a self-starter, and doing it, getting to a level where you're sort of making, a living off of it is trickier, but starting is easy. And the starting is the thing you have to do to get started.
On your journey, are there any obstacles?
For sure. I mean, it's and even on my journey, and then even probably even more extreme still, there's not that many. This is more talking about the sort of job side of things. Like, there's not that many jobs for it in sort of the lane I chose, which is being independent media journalism. Like, that's the sort of shrinking group of people, especially from the US. Like, I think when my first slam I did for the New York Times in person was doing the 2012 Australian Open, and there were probably, I would guess, 7 or 8 American reporters there from various different outlets and magazines and newspapers. And then at this most recent Australian Open, there were just two of us. So it really has shrunk quite a bit, just because of media not being the most resilient or most booming industry right now, and a lot of content creation. He even used that term. Is now done in house by the tours and the federations, and so a lot of people who were formerly my colleagues on the journalistic side have gone to work for tournaments or for the tours, whatever it may be, and that works for them. I mean, that's a viable career, and I'm not knocking that, but it's a different sort of path that I didn't go down. So the path that I chose, I feel like, has narrowed a bit, in terms of that. And then there's also, yeah, there's a lot of things to learn. Like, I didn't go to school for journalism, so I kind of had to learn largely by observing, which there are obviously learning curves, and you know can be precarious at times, but also I think, for me, was great experience. It was pretty invaluable. I think you can learn a lot more by actually doing it than you can by studying about it in theory. Is my understanding.
Yeah, totally. I feel like, especially now, there's like so much internship opportunities as well, and just learning from, for me at least, when I'm like looking at press conferences videos on YouTube, I tend to observe how like journalists ask questions,
Hmm.
and I think it's a really good way for someone like me to sort of know the way if I am in their position.
Yeah.
And I guess that sort of leads me to my next questions, because you mentioned about how it's like the media is not doing super well. We're not as flourishing as it was before. So, and my mom was like, well, my parents, they're like, if you choose a major that's like in STEM, for example, and then you graduate, your starting salary will be way higher than like a sporting journalist.
Yeah.
So we don't have to like put this part in my podcast, but I just want to know that how, like, what's the reality of being a sports journalist?
Yeah, no, they're not. I mean, she's not totally wrong. I mean, there is, it is tough. That's what I was trying. I'm trying not to be overly, sunshiny about that. Like, I do think there is a reality that it is a tough thing in this day and age to make a job, and it's shrinking. There's websites, media websites, like, I know Vice just closed. Other, various newspapers have rolling sort of layoffs. You hear about people leaving, like, Helena Elliott, who was the tennis writer. They didn't have a really full time one, but she did tennis for the Los Angeles Times. She just took a buyout recently after a long, great career. And I don't know if they're going to send anyone to really replace her anyway. So it is tough, and it is shrinking. So it's not trending in a way, for someone your age, or for someone, from your parents, friend with a daughter your age, where if they're concerned, about making a secure living and having that be guaranteed. Yes, there definitely are other fields out there that are more promising and more sort of secure in terms of that. But as you said, this is the thing you want to do and you love. I think it's worth giving a shot. And you can have things to fall back on too. I mean, you can. There's lots of people. Like, I have a friend actually who I just saw a couple times within the last few months because she lives in the DC area, who was also a tennis blogger. Um, but now she tried to sort of, she was on tour, you know, going to a handful of tournaments a year. I don't know, 6 or 7 tournaments a year, maybe. This is about 10, 11, 12 years ago. But for the last, I don't know, 9, 10 years, she's been doing various, say, biology research things at a lab, and she has been working in STEM, and she has, made a living from that, and now still just enjoys tennis as a hobby. But she got to say she did it. She got to experience what that world was like and got to be there. And I think for me, a success story. I mean, like she got to do what she wanted to do. She got to give it a shot. It didn't wind up sort of finding her footing in it, and also had some things she liked and didn't like about it. And we had lunch or something a few months ago, and sort of had this conversation where it's sort of both of us like the grass is greener on the other side. Like she says, "Oh, you get to be on tennis, you get to travel the world and see other stuff," and I'm like, "But you get to be in one place and have like a stable home life and a job with secure benefits and salary and all these sorts of things." So yes, the part about getting to do what you love is great. It can sometimes be a little bit self-indulgent. Yeah, so there's both sides to it. Like it is, I think you can also do things and study things in a way and still do tennis in a way that leaves other options for you, but you can still give yourself a shot. The same, not dissimilar from the way that like tennis players, even, like a lot of them more and more choose to go to college rather than just going to the pros. So they have this degree, usually from tennis, usually from a better school they would have gotten into without tennis. Academically, often, certainly like a lot of the Stanford players, let's say, got into Stanford largely because of their tennis, not because of their Stanford quality academics all the time, bluntly. But now, because of that, they have these degrees to fall back on, or they're able to finish whenever they do hang up their rackets. So yeah, your mom is not wrong when she's saying these things in a lot of ways, but at the same time, I also think there are ways to do it. And you can do it as like a sometime summer job thing too, and get some tastes of covering tennis. And that's what I sort of did, not during college, but during my early career days when I was working just as like a temp and doing other sort of small jobs, getting credentialed for a few local tournaments near me. Um, gave me the sense that I wanted to keep doing it, which not everyone does. Not everyone finds their footing, enjoys it, and is successful at it, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I also feel like a lot of tennis players that are retired tend to take on a lot of like sports commentary jobs, and
Mm-hmm.
I feel like viewers tend to like to hear more of what they want to say compared to what a lot of journalists want to say. Maybe it's just how I feel because I feel like they're in the field, they've actively played, so a lot of people just want to get their opinion.
Yeah, no, that's the thing that comes up for sure. I mean, there's this sort of bias among certainly former players that only former players know what they're talking about when it comes to tennis. You do encounter that sometimes. And, I don't think people actually leave conversations with me thinking I don't know what I'm talking about almost ever. But there is this perception that they can have sort of, which, that the people who didn't play are unqualified in a certain way and can't really experience it. It comes up in little things too, like, or not little things, but in sort of odd moments, like this past week, with Andre Rublev getting just defaulted from the match in Dubai. People are like, "Oh well, if you've never played, you don't understand the emotions of that moment." I was like, "I've watched enough tennis and been, a human being long enough to understand like what the emotions are in that moment and how he acted was not normal and was not within the expectations of what we want people to be doing." And so there will be that pushback from some athletes, like you don't understand how it is because you never played. And even some commenters, like I get people in my mentions on Twitter saying that, like, "Oh, you don't understand because you never played." Um, I think you can work around that, and also there's lots of things that the athletes, former athletes, are very much less well equipped or less articulate about talking about, especially when it comes to a lot of the various, social or political issues that intertwine with tennis. They are not usually very well versed in that. They're not usually very articulate in that. And speaking of broad brushes, some are, but largely not. And it's not what they were hired to do. Yeah, I think often then you're sort of, as a viewer and as a journalist, I'm biased probably, but I'm sort of left wanting to hear from some responsible journalists on the microphone in these situations. And there's not always one there, but sometimes there is. When there is, it's a relief because yeah, athletes are not. They bring a certain kind of something, but I think the best broadcasts for me are ones that have a mix. Ones that have like a journalist or someone with journalistic chops on the main call, and then have a sort of expert on the real technique experience side of things doing color. I think it's a good combination. It's kind of 50-50.
Are there any more like misconceptions that you as a journalist wants to just like declare that's like it's a misconception, I guess?
It's a broad question. One thing I think is different for your generation than for me is that, and I don't know if it's a misconception per se, but when I was coming up, we did not have, um, or I remember we did not have access certainly to full videos of press conferences, and even having transcripts available all the time was a pretty new thing when I was a fan, because press conferences were originally not ever meant, and arguably still aren't meant, but kind of are now, to be these things that are like consumed in this raw press conference form. It was previously just they were held so that players would say things that you could quote and then put in an article, and the article was the product. The press conference itself was almost more like the raw ore that you were mining out of the mine. And then you would use it and distill it and sort of sift it into whatever kind of gems you would pull out of it to make your article. And now the viewers and the public and the fans are given this raw material. So I think sometimes they can be um, more, which leads to more scrutiny, I guess, from certain people who are this inclined that way to be critical of a given question, or sort of say, who asked this? Why would this person make this mistake and get this fact wrong on their question, or ask this player this question that made the player uncomfortable, whatever it may be. And so I just think that it's an adjustment on both sides. But yeah, generally, this is not what the press conference was originally made for. They weren't originally made to be standalone documents or products, that could be consumed all as one. I think it's great for fans. And I remember reading transcripts for the first time when they started popping up on Grand Slam websites, gosh, almost like 20 years ago. Um, that they were very enlightening. But yeah, but it is something where, it's just when you're asking the question, you're doing it because usually you have a story that it fits into, or something that it makes sense in, and just sometimes in context of this press conference. Like one silly example, but I was once writing a story during Wimbledon for the New York Times about all the effort that Wimbledon's gardeners put into their flowers around the grounds. And so the way they always found the story was like men's quarterfinal day, I think it was. So I wound up asking like three of the winners of those matches that day, who were the big three on the men's side, like what they thought of the flowers at Wimbledon. And so all these questions, and some people were like, "This is ridiculous. Why is anyone asking about flowers? Like, come on, like, what are they doing?" And actually, Djokovic and Federer both gave great answers to it. But I'm doing it because I'm working on a story about flowers at Wimbledon, which is a sort of sidebar story with lots of photos of gardening at Wimbledon, right? It's not because, and so it gets kind of mocked in the context of a press conference, but in the context of reading the actual article for which is what I needed those sort of player voices in, it made sense.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to our second area, which for me, like a lot of these questions I ask are like for me, sort of, because I really want to learn.
Sure, no, it's your show. It's good. It's good.
Okay, so my next question is sort of about behind the scenes of being a journalist. I just want to
Mhm.
like to talk through the process of attending a tournament as a journalist, because when I attend the U.S. Open, I like always admire those guys with like the lanyards. It's like so cool because they get to go in the press conferences rooms.
Yeah.
So I just want to know how that process is like.
Yeah, so I mean, basics of getting a lanyard. I mean, you apply for the accreditation, which is the badge at the end of the lanyard that you wear around your neck. And U.S. Open, or whatever the tournament may be, looks at your application, what outlet you're applying on behalf of, and approves or rejects it. And the U.S. Open is one of, and the Grand Slams generally are the most sort of selective. They have the most demand, people wanting to go cover those tournaments, and so they are the hardest ones to get approved for compared to some of the smaller tournaments, and even like exhibition events, or World Team Tennis or a Challenger. World Team Tennis is no longer existing right now, but that's one of the first things I got credentialed for was World Team Tennis back in the day. However you get your foot in the door, that gives you access to certain areas, usually to a media workroom as a basic, and where there's sort of desks and monitors you can watch play, and outlets, and you can do your work there and write there, and have a little space that's your own, at a table or a desk, whatever it may be. Sometimes it's like library carols almost in there. And at the Grand Slams and other big tournaments, you often have your own monitor. You can choose and flip between feeds from any court, which is pretty cool. And they also have stats available on there, which is nice. Um, and so more detailed stats that are often available on the website. So that may be changing a bit with the websites, but it's a pretty good interface for immediate information. And so, and gives you details on stuff like how long each rally was, and all sorts of nice stuff that you can use in your reports. And the badge for media will also get you into the press conferences, which are held, and you sort of do players come in if they're either an enormously overwhelmingly huge star that's not automatically put in. I'm talking like Serena, Federer, Djokovic kind of level people, or they be requested. And so you, at the beginning of each day, you go to the whoever the administrator is, it's from ATP or WTA or from the USTA if it's the US Open, let's say, and you get a list of here's who I want to talk to. And they usually encourage you, or there's sort of a gentle encouragement, especially for more obscure players, to request them win only, have them only come in if they win. Um, and then it's because they think they're in a better mood. And so oftentimes fewer players who lose will come in unless it's something like, they're a Hungarian player and they're the only Hungarian player in the tournament, and the Hungarian reporter is just there to cover how the Hungarians do at the tournament. Then yeah, the Hungarian player is probably more likely to get asked in by his or her local reporters to do that. So it varies a bit by country how the norms are. The US, for example, like we have so many players, and I hope the US players are grateful for this. That we actually, and also just how we cover it. We don't cover the sport, we cover it more globally. We don't foremost cover just how the Americans are doing in a tournament. There is an element to that, but it's not the only thing we do compared to like the Brits. The Brits really will foreground, certainly first week of the Grand Slam, how the Brits are doing will be their main story. Um, yeah, but so like for example, like someone like I think Francis Tiafoe even like loses second round of Australian Open. I don't think he did a press conference after because us two American reporters who were there, we weren't covering him super closely and could kind of let him go. So yeah, so they come in and obviously, and then you can ask them whatever you want, really. There's no real restriction. Sometimes if it's a one-on-one interview, that's more optional for the player to say yes or no to it. And sometimes they will ask if there's a specific topic you want to ask about. They'll say like, what's this about? If it's about, oh, it's about your new coach, or oh, it's about your comeback from injury, or oh, it's about I'm doing a story on how left-handed players, train, or whatever it may be, whatever your topic may be. In a press conference where the top big room and the top players come in, it's a great chance for people from any outlet to get a chance to ask a question to the biggest stars, your Djokovic or Swiatek or Osaka or whoever else it may be who are there. Anyone who got any level of access to this tournament can go in. It's not just for the biggest people, where often for those big stars they're probably not doing any one-on-ones actually at a Grand Slam tournament, but but the people who work for outlets like the New York Times are more likely to get yeses for one-on-ones at a big tournament, which was definitely a nice advantage for me for many years working there. And yeah, so that's basically it. You kind of just have to keep an eye on when so there's the schedule of matches, and there's also a separate schedule of when players who have finished are coming in for their matches. And usually they come in between, I would say, 45 to let's say 75 minutes after they finish. It's not usually that. Sometimes if a player loses and it is in a really bad mood, or in a specific kind of bad mood, I should say, and just wants to get it over with, sometimes they'll come right in. Um, that's pretty rare. There are certain players who do it after they lose at Grand Slams, like um, Serena did it a few times. Djokovic has done it a few times. I think Federer even did it a few times where you come in within 5-10 minutes of losing. But usually they kind of go cool down a bit in the locker room and sometimes take a shower and just sort of like vent or scream or cry or just get upset, whatever they want to do to process their loss, honestly. And then they'll kind of come in a bit more collected. Usually there's a bit of a waiting time. So you have to balance watching the matches that are going on, especially like first week, and keeping track of what's going on court while still making sure you get to all the appointments you want to make with the players who are coming in. So it's a lot of tricky time management, especially at a Grand Slam where there's, 64 singles matches on the first day, essentially.
I remember you mentioned in your Naomi biography that before, when you had to request for a press conference, you were like one of the few people who were there that requested to watch Naomi, but after she became famous, like every press conference, every journalist wanted to see her. And I think that's just super cool. I think the ability for you guys to just choose who you want to like sort of see that are like on the rise is super cool, and to sort of like, I don't know, for you it's to like predict that they'll become a big star. I think it's really cool.
That's part of it for sure. Part of it is the tennis and seeing who becomes a big star, and part of it also is how interesting they are. Time management, bluntly, how good a use of your time they are. If there's someone who doesn't say anything interesting, you probably won't request them as much. But if they are someone who is interesting or is different or has a unique voice or point of view, you request them a lot more. And so there are players. I was actually doing a panel about the book in New York a couple weeks ago, last 10 days ago, um, with two players, Andrea Petkovic and Leslie Allen, who's a former player from like the 70s and 80s. And both those women actually were sort of known for getting media coverage and requests beyond their ranking or results sometimes too. I mean, and Pecco was like a top 10 player. She was like a lower let. She spent a lot of time, ranked between let's say like 8 and 12 in the world. She was a top player for quite a bit. Leslie didn't get to top 10 ever, but Leslie was also known as being very articulate and interesting story and stuff. So she'd get brought in um, a lot more than your average player. So there are certain players, yeah, who you can look at in the rankings who don't get covered as much and don't get talked to as much because when they do come in, it's just not a good use of anyone's time, honestly. And sometimes it's about their personality. Sometimes it's about them not speaking great English can be part of it. If it just, especially they're really not comfortable in English, it can be uncomfortable for everyone involved. So certain players get requested less because of that, or only get requested, let's say, if they're making it into like a semifinal or a final, when it's like really you have to talk about their match. Um, but early on, when there's a lot of options, they might not get picked. So yes, it's different. It's a separate sort of rankings that have to do a bit with star power, let's say, or personality that you sort of look at for who gets, and also past, whatever ranking Serena was in a given time, she was always getting requested because she was always Serena. And Naomi will have that too. Naomi will always, for the rest of her career, always be that star who at least was that huge lead character in the sport for a very long time, or for a very significant portion of time. So yeah, it's a different sort of thing who you request, and yeah, it's not always about who's the best player. And
I also want to ask about journalism ethics because, as like someone who reads news, find myself to just click on sort of like clickbaity
yeah,
titles because I guess it's just like human nature. So I was wondering, as like a journalist, how do you make sure that your articles are factual but entertaining at the same time?
yeah, hopefully they're entertaining on some level or newsworthy to be writing them. I mean, it's something that usually I don't write. I almost never have written about things that no one cares about because even like certainly when I was writing for the New York Times, if they didn't think it was interesting, they would say no, we're not going to waste time editing and publishing, and because it takes some time for someone on the back end to put up photo and format and write headlines and write social media blurbs, whatever, to do an article. There is some resources that have to go into it, and those got tighter over time too. There were times when the number of editors working at the paper got cut, and they started wanting to be more selective about which stories they would do. So I wanted to write a story. I remember there was one time specifically. This is not very important, but I guess a guy who'd won a couple like 250s on clay one year, and I wanted to write about him for the first round of the French Open. Like, here's this guy who just won his match, and he's playing well. And my editors were like, "This is not an important person. Like, he's not ranked high enough. Like, they were unconvinced that this was a story worth telling." So it's kind of a debate between us there. So that can happen for sure. But on the clickbait side, there's definitely way more. This is a development in the last like 3 4 years, especially. There's so many more content mill kind of sites that are just churning out story after story after story after story with very sort of sensational headlines um, about what just to get people to click, like, and I get involved in them even too. Like, I write a tweet and people write headlines off my tweets, like, like tennis expert slams X, whatever, like something to like make it you want to click on. And it almost never, sometimes I do slam things, but not always. Sometimes it's just exaggerating whatever got said. And just trying to find any way, any little seed you can use to make content off of in a way that didn't used to exist when it was just newspapers. I mean, newspapers were not doing clickbait per se. These are really more sites that are almost all written by people who are not on-site journalists. They're almost all written by people who are writing from. So yeah, it's a different sort of landscape, and that can be tough because a lot of times players will see those sort of misleading headlines from those sites and resent them or get mad at them and not understand that it's not the journalists who they're actually seeing face to face who are doing that. It's other people somewhere else around the world who are often distorting what they're saying. Not always, but sometimes it does happen, and sometimes they get things wrong or just don't put things as sensitively or precisely as a player would want them to, or exaggerate something. So that can be tricky. That can definitely sort of erode the trust or the faith between the journalists and the players. That can be tough.
The other question is about artificial intelligence because I feel like, especially for me, when I am sort of like actually having a job being a sports journalist, I feel like AI is just gonna keep on developing. It just like never stops. So I think it's also another. Before I talked about how retired tennis players sort of are taking on what sports journalists are doing, but I feel like AI are also like doing the same thing.
Yeah, AI is taking over a lot of jobs in a lot of different areas of the world. It's not just writing is one of the things for sure. There are all these things you can put in AI or chat GPT, whatever, write a 500-word essay about you know this battle of the Civil War, and it will do it for you and kind of do your homework. You're a student, you might know more about these applications than I probably do, but I'm sure it's very tempting to have that happen. um, but also, at least for now, AI writing is usually recognizable as such, and it's usually not very good. And it usually doesn't sound human. It usually sounds weird. It will probably continue to improve. I imagine the AI will keep getting better, unfortunately, for people in these jobs, but it will keep getting better. Yeah, even just the other day, I was sort of playing around with an idea and was in one of those like AI picture generators and had some requests that was really basic. That was like, make a circle divided into like eight eighths, like eight parts, and it couldn't do it. Like it was giving me like 14. It couldn't count to eight. The AI picture generator. It was like giving always like weird
Oh,
asymmetrical circles, and just
what?
like it didn't. It looks like this is such a basic question. Like any human would understand what you wanted to do, but for
Yeah.
some reason, whatever AI picture generator it was, but it just couldn't do it. And so, yeah, there are certain things, like Sports Illustrated. Last year had some scandal where they realized that one of their sort of owners was farming out certain articles to basically AI generation, and they were writing really stupid things in there. Like one of the challenges to playing volleyball is that you have to have a ball or something like that. It was like, okay, like no human would ever write this, but a machine thinks this is a clever thing to write. So I don't think they're coming for our jobs that quickly. But it probably will continue to be a thing, and that could be a thing for a lot of different jobs. I mean, it's not just, this. It could be, bankers or whatever other sort of other jobs that machines can learn to do. This, lots of jobs have gotten replaced by automation over the years in manufacturing or in whatever else it may be. And so, yeah, they're kind of coming for us all in some level. So,
Okay, my next question is what's your best moment on tour?
in terms of like what I saw on court, or like my own personal career, or
Like covering the tour, like what is like for example your favorite article you wrote
hmm.
or like the process you enjoyed from writing it?
Yeah, sort of a probably unexpected answer. I mean, there was one article I remember writing. This was probably in 2014, so 10 years, gosh, 10 years ago at the French Open. I did an article interviewing. It was unusual because I wound up taking like sort of the morning or afternoon away from the tournament site and going to the hotel of the player, Timea Baczynski, um, and doing an interview with her that she'd agreed to do later. After she'd played the day before and she had like 2 days off for her next match or something. And so I went to her hotel and interviewed her, and she had this like incredibly fascinating. I can send you a link to it, but like this story about her decision to step away from tennis and to go to like she was going to hotel management school and like sort of finding herself and finding her life. And she was just like super super open and talkative and stuff. And it was this small story that no one really knew, but it was just super compelling and interesting to me. And just getting this sort of connection with her and with her story, and then thankfully having the New York Times be game to publish it. It could have been 5 times as long with how much she talked, but to publish it in some form about this player who was ranked just probably around 100 or 80 in the world at this time. That was a memorable story, just for sort of feeling like I got something different, or made took a risk by leaving the tournament site. Even, and her hotel was like less than a mile away from the tournament. It was not a big departure, but to step away from the sort of addiction of being on site all the time and to do this sort of different pursuit, I think wound up being really cool. And she wound up becoming a top player, making semifinals the next year of the French Open, and yeah, one more time after that as well. And it was interesting case of just sort of small story, and that kind of human story. That was the great thing about writing for the New York Times, and also especially that I was the second person there, because they had Chris Clary, who was a staffer for the New York Times for a long time, who would kind of largely do like the sort of top line stories. Mostly he would do, here's what Federer and Serena did today, and which would give me a lot of freedom to write sort of sidebar, I would say, articles, like less obvious topics, which I really liked. I really liked having that kind of freedom to do that. So Baczynski, for some reason, is the first idea that comes to mind for me. Not that it was any sort of big like investigation or expose, which I've done some of it, which can be satisfying in their own way. But it's just sort of just a very sort of human story. And I feel like I had a connection formed in this interview.
Okay, now we'll move on to our last section, which is advice. So, I just want to know what you think are some key skills or traits that are essential for being someone that's like really active interview to players, because a lot of my teachers are like, you need to be really talkative, you need to be really curious, and you have to like practice your skill a lot. Like, even you have to write, even though it won't be just like write and try to pitch it as often as possible.
I think that what I would say on that front is that it's you have to be willing to sort of initiate conversations and not be shy. Like you have to be able to ask for interviews, to ask for credentials, to ask, um, questions in a setting too. You can be soft spoken and you can be someone who's, naturally sometimes you have to be a bit extroverted in the job for sure to get to talk to other people all the time, but you can be you don't have to be like a loud personality per se. But you do have to put yourself out there and to reach out and to ask questions and to say, hey, um, you know, WTA, I'm contacting you about this, story I'm writing about, X, whatever business thing you're doing, and have you respond to sort of explain or justify whatever this thing is that I'm writing about that I don't agree with or whatever it may be. Like there are certain things, that you have to be able to step up and be proactive on, and to keep starting for yourself. And you really have to, just sort of throw a lot of things out there all the time. Like certainly like for this book I just did, I was like reaching out to literally like hundreds of people. I didn't actually, I should maybe someday go count how many people I talked to for the book, but it was a lot. And like a lot of them who were like kids who Naomi played when she was a junior and stuff, I reached out to a few voices like that. That was me like finding them on Facebook or on LinkedIn or whatever it may be to try to find these women who, and just as complete strangers, be like, hi, you don't know me, but I'm doing this thing and hoping you can chat. And being willing to sort of put yourself out there that way is a certain kind of skill or a certain kind of personality that you need to develop in order to be that kind of outgoing, and to be ready for rejection, also to have people to ignore you or to say no or whatever else it may be. Like you have to kind of learn to handle the disappointment of that and not let it get you too down. Because there are certainly people, who I wanted to talk to for the book who didn't ever respond or who said no, various different sort of important people and not important people alike. So that was tricky, but that's the kind of thing I think you have to do, to go present yourself, to give yourself the opportunity, because they won't come find you. It's not like someone's like, hey, I played Naomi when I was 7, or I heard you were writing on a book. Let me tell you about my stuff. That very, very rarely happens in any sort of situation. So you have to be a self-starter and go out and ask for it if you ever want to get it. And then yeah, and be prepared for to not get it potentially, and also work with that too. So it's tough because a lot of times as a journalist, as a writer, your fate's not totally in your own hands. Like you have to have cooperation from people. You have to build up trust and rapport. And so that can be with players on tour who come to trust you over time, or even people, who are meeting you for the first time for a story. Like if you're writing about some new player and they have a coach you've never met before, and you want to interview the coach, like you have to convince the coach to talk to you or the parents to talk to you, whoever it may be. And oftentimes people are generally helpful for the most part, but it's not predictable always who will be and who won't be. What kind of mood they're in that day. Yeah, I think it's helpful to just sort of learn that. And you can learn that, by doing lots of smaller scale stuff, certainly working for like a local or student newspaper, even at lots of places, you can learn those skills, like going to an event and talking to organizers and people saying, hey, I'm here doing a story about this. That's the kind of thing you can learn for sure at a smaller scale that can translate to a top level tennis thing, for example.
Yeah, I think practice also helps a lot. Just like, I feel like getting used to being rejected.
And just not intimidated too. I mean, like it can be easy to be intimidated by someone who, for a tennis player, you only know from watching on TV, and all of a sudden they're right in front of you, and you have a chance to ask them whatever you want, and you should, with responsibly and with some degree of care, take that opportunity, and ask what you want to ask for your story, and then have whoever is up there at the podium, get the chance to answer that.
Sometimes I even get intimidated when I'm asking selfies for players because it's like someone I look up
Yeah.
to and they're just like right there, and I'm like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that can be for sure intimidating for sure, but then hopefully it's worth it if you get the selfie that you want. And it's the same thing. It's the same sort of skill for this job. And it is part of their jobs that they're up there. The players understand the give and take, and they won't, sometimes the questions, they won't always like the question. It may be certainly very much depending on what the question is. If they heard the same question last week, sometimes they don't understand all the time that not everyone is at every press conference, essentially, or and you're covering 20 press conferences a day at a peak, and might not have the time to sort of index what everyone's been asked in every past press conference, that sort of thing. So yeah, like it takes a bit of a resilience and a bit of a thick skin for sure to deal with the disappointments of it, but it can pay off when it works, when it's successful. Hopefully it's worth it. And again, you reach out and ask, me to be on here, which is already a good step, that you're reaching out and getting people you're interested in. So
My last question is, what are some of your advices for people like me?
you're doing a great job with what you have as your opportunities now. So I would just say keep that up. Um, keep having initiative to start your own stuff, not waiting for anyone to invite you to it, being a self-starter, putting yourself out there, and just keep doing it. And the more you do your podcast, like the more your confidence in your voice will grow, the more comfortable you'll be doing it. And you can get that comfort while still having authenticity of your personality. Doesn't You don't have to try to sound like everyone else. You can still have your own voice, but I think you'll learn your voice, what you want to say, how you want to say it. I think all those things will come. You're already further along than a lot of them are in terms of starting your stuff. I'm impressed by that, and I'm definitely wishing you the best.
Thank you. Thank you again so much for listening to this episode. It's truly a long one. I spent so long editing. I've never realized how long editing can be, but I guess just showed me how long and how sort of interesting it can be, because listening to yourself, you really learn a lot about this episode and how sort of you speak in a way. So yeah, I really hope you guys enjoyed. It was really an enjoyable experience for me, and I learned a lot, so really grateful. And again, if you guys want to go follow all of our social medias, it's always in the show notes. And I also provided a link to Ben Rothenberg's biography if you guys want to go check it out. I read it, and there's an episode on my podcast which is a book review, so make sure to check that out if you want. And yeah, we'll end up to this episode here. Really hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.